I'm Lawrence Llewellyn-Bowen, and I'm absolutely delighted to be here to celebrate William Morris's 182nd birthday. Yay, go William. In fact, I think he's looking incredibly good for his age. One of the things that's so extraordinary about William Morris, and one of the things that I think this event, The Brilliance of William Morris, really celebrates, is the fact that actually he's still so approachable. His work is still so communicative. And that even now, 182 years later, he's still such an incredibly recognisable brand, but a brand that comes with so much goodwill, so much sense of happiness built into it. So congratulations, William Morris. I am delighted to be here. Very, very wisely, everyone persuaded me not to jump out of a birthday cake, because that could have got quite messy.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, I think I have to say that is both the most flattering introduction and the best warm-up act I have ever had. I am not going to be talking so much about Morris as about a picture of the world in which he interacted with Forest. I'm not going to bombard you with names or dates. But there's one name which is particularly important, and that is Frederick Barlow Guy. He was the third head of Forest, and probably the person who moulded Forest more than anybody else in the 19th century. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to cover a period between approximately 1850 and 1880, but without hitting you with dates. Now, why William Morris and F.B. Guy came together was because Morris had been at Marlborough College. Marlborough College is the other school at which I taught, and so I do know a bit about it. Marlborough College at the time was primitive, even by the primitive standards of the mid-19th century independent schools. And just before Morris left, his parents took him away because there was a rebellion. The boys just couldn't stand the brutality of the staff. And instead of submitting to the absenteeism, the no lessons and the beatings, they rose up. The school hasn't looked back since. It's really quite good now. And so Morris, whose family were living in this area, came to be tutored by F.B. Guy, who was at the time, he was the deputy head here. He was tutored for what was called his matriculation examinations at Oxford. Now, the thing that I'm going to be saying some things which some of you will know inside out anyway. I apologize for that. Some of them may be fairly new to you. The central cultural aspect of F.B. Guy, who was a clergyman, was the particular brand of Church of England faith to which he belonged. He was what we call a Tractarian. More easily, perhaps we'd call it sort of high church. And this was an age which really defined you. It was dangerous, frankly. It was thought that the Tractarians were 3/4 of the way to being Roman Catholics. Now, only about 4 or 5 miles away from here is a memorial set up during this period, which is essentially anti-immigrants. It's in Stratford. It's in St. John's, Stratford, which is in the church with the road going each side of it. They've grown trees around it now, so you can't see it. But what it is about, it's called the Martyrs' Memorial. And it's a wonderful splurge of hostility to Roman Catholics. The reason for this was that West Ham Council, for the first time, had got a majority of elected councillors who were, of course, immigrants. They were Irish Roman Catholics. And the Earl of Shaftesbury made a horrific speech, a horrific anti-Catholic speech there. So Guy, in standing by his principles, was really taking quite a stand. The chapel had been opened in the term before he became headmaster, but he was responsible for an awful lot of the work here. And the sort of motto of the High Church, the Tractarians, the main thing about their attitude to church architecture, church decoration, was the concept of the beauty of holiness. And Morris, still a great friend of Guy's, and also part of this extraordinary network, which is more or less a who's who of all Victorian church architects, sculptors, decorators, stained glass people, advised him. And his first advice in the letter to Guy was that we should have panelling with figures and things on the panels. Now, the panelling we've got here is significantly older than Forest School's chapel. If you are sitting sort of round about there and you run your fingers against the panelling, you'll find initials, and there's some over there as well. And the initials and the dates are a good 100 years before Forest School. And the reason for that is this panelling is actually from the chapel of Jesus College, Oxford, where a major church architect called Street, who knew Guy, was refurbishing the chapel, and so he brought all of these panels to Forest. So what is, as it were, ancient about Forest predates Forest. And there's one other bit, which I'll come to in a moment, which predates Forest by about 600 years. Now, the windows almost all came from the Morris factory. The one I'd love to show you, but can't, is behind the organ. There is a replacement, David and Jonathan, there, which was designed by Burne-Jones, and we have got the cartoon for it there. It is not the original because a flying bomb hit Forest School towards the end of the war, and actually was very fortuitous because nobody was killed, and it also destroyed the only very ancient building we had, which was the Manor farmhouse, which we wouldn't have been allowed to take down and replace with the Martin Centre, which we did a couple of years ago. Now, one of the pictures, I'm afraid at windows you can't see it very clearly, is that one up there. Now, it's got in it what generations of foresters, the last 20 years of foresters, think is an angel. Now, it's not actually an angel. It is from the Morris factory. It is, in fact, the first Mrs. Guy. Undoubtedly, all headmasters and male wardens who've had wives have had angelic wives. But that is actually the first Mrs. Guy. She died in childbirth. And even by the standards of energetic, monogamous Victorian clergymen, Guy was pretty energetic. He had 20 children, 12 of them through the first Mrs. Guy. The statues, very, 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 very typically Tractarian. Now, the angels, we do know where they came from. They came from a works in Exeter, and the man who designed them was a man called Harry Hems. Now, he was a great designer. He probably did most of the statues we have down there, but he also was a bit of a rogue. He didn't like paying his tax, and eventually the tax people arrived at his studios and confiscated several works, ironically, they took away one statue of his, which was of Matthew the tax collector. I think it's unlikely that these statues had been painted when they were first here, and they've had interesting things happening to them. When I first came to Forest, this statue of Michael killing the dragon, or the devil, was unusual because it looked as if Michael was miming it, because there wasn't a spear there. And about 25 years ago, the chapel was refurbished, and somebody enterprising from the firm that was doing this, Fuller's, of whom I'm delighted to see a representative over there, went out to B&Q and bought what is unmistakably a broom handle, which you can see there, where it has been sharpened slightly and silver painted on the bottom. Once you know it's a B&Q broom handle, it's a bit difficult to take it terribly seriously. But this tradition actually carried on into very recent years. There are some angels you can see on top of the new organ. And those were actually carved by Peter Phillips, who was a member of the maintenance staff at Forest, keeping up this tradition. The organ, when I first came here, was up in the gallery there. And what that has uncovered is a bit of glass which is not from the original chapel, but is very much in the tradition that I think came from the Morris factory. It's a rose window, and it's facing directly towards the west. And so in the summer, if you come in here at about 8 o'clock in the evening, the light is shining straight, there's a red light shining straight onto the altar from that window, which is very, very typical of the attention to detail and beauty in the design of this chapel. Now, in the dining hall, those who are familiar with it will know that there's a William Morris banner. He designed it and he oversaw the way it was woven. In it, it's got something very famous for Forest School, which are the oak leaves, the school badge. And it is often thought that perhaps Guy suggested this to Morris. The origin, I think, and this is just my view, is far older than that, and you'll find it if you go to the theatre foyer. Because in the theatre foyer, there is some early medieval stained glass. And that stained glass is from Howden Minster. And surprise, surprise, Guy's father was rector of Howden. Some of this glass survived the Reformation, and it survived Cromwell as well. But a lot didn't. And what it seems to have happened, because there's no real record of this, is that Guy acquired these fragments. Now, if you look at that glass, and there's a light which you can put on so that it shines through the glass, at the top left, you will see the oak leaves and the acorns, some 700 years old now, which I think are what became Forest's motto, as it were. Now, finally in here, there is a bronze of F.B. Guy just over there. And that is actually done by one of the most distinguished Victorian and 20th century monumental sculptors. He did a lot of public sculpture. There's a man called Goscombe John. For all sorts of complicated reasons, I own the maquette of a public statue of his, which is in a little village in North Wales. Now, that was exhibited in the Great Exhibition, I think it was, or the RA exhibition, before it came here. And it's very fitting that this man who knew and tutored Morris is celebrated in something which is a very fine example of a sort of monumental effigy. And a final thought. This building very much represents in its proportions that sort of vision that Morris and F.B. Guy had. If you stand in the quad and you look at it, you will realise why it is such a good building, because the proportion of the wall, the vertical wall, and then the roof is such that your eyes are pulled upwards the whole time. That is the whole point of the chapel, is to lift your eyes up. And that is what Guy wanted for the boys at Forest. All boys, of course, in those days. You can compare it with what was put up, was planned at the end of Guy's reign here as a memorial to him. The proportions, if you stand in the quad and look at the dining hall, the proportions are entirely the other way round. What you get is a huge slab of vertical wall and a fairly small bit of roof. And the effect of looking at them, you look at the dining hall and you feel it's oppressing you, it's pushing you down. You look at the chapel and it's lifting you up. And I think that's a very, very good image of Guy and of William Morris. Thank you.
Thank you.